And somebody's in the kitchen. We'll be live in 3, 2, 1. Here we go. We're live.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Hello. I am Antonia Dean. I am the Director of Startup Pipeline Diversity for Comcast NBC Universal Startup Engagement Team. And I am so excited to be here at Philly Tech Week this year. So excited. We are joined here today, specifically our session right now is on how communities across the country are mobilizing to support underrepresented founders. And I'm so excited to introduce you to our panelists who have such great insights sitting at different cities and being able to see what startup ecosystems and communities are able to do. But before we get started, I just want to share a few quick housekeeping points. I'm going to have some prepared questions for the panelists, but of course we want to engage the audience as well. So feel free to add, if you look over on the right-hand sidebar, there's a Q&A area. Feel free to pop in there with your questions. There'll be a set time at the end where we'll take questions, but if you have a question specific to something someone just said, please pop it in there. I'm going to keep my eye on it. I won't make promises that we'll get there, but I'll try my best that we can get there and have an ongoing discussion in real time. Also, please definitely engage, ask us questions. We are 14 months into being on Zooms and Teams and Excel and every kind of video platform. And we don't want anyone to feel like they're speaking into the void or playing to a dead room. So please engage, please ask your questions. And with that said, I'm going to introduce our panelists and get us started. So our first panelist is Monica Wheat. Monica is the Executive Director of Venture Catalyst. She is a strategist, educator, investor, and venture developer. She is the founder and Executive Director of Venture Catalyst, a nonprofit venture and ecosystem development group focused on investor and founder education and innovation hub and large-scale entrepreneurial initiatives for over 45,000 attendees. Monica is also the Techstars Startup Programs lead, where she's focused on leading programs globally and founding co-director of Startup Boost, a global pre-accelerator. She served as a consultant for Backstage Capital, co-producing their multi-city live investment tour, and was the managing director of the Backstage Capital Detroit Accelerator, a 4-city global tech accelerator investing 3 months and $100,000 each in scaling startups for underrepresented founders. So Monica knows what she's doing here. Our next panelist is Adeleke Omitowoju. He is partner in 1863 Ventures. In his role there, he manages the multi-sector portfolio and leads due diligence for the fund. He brings a decade of experience across enterprise sales, private equity, and startup advisory. Ade started his career at Avenue Capital Group as an analyst in New Delhi, India. He then joined IBM as a client executive, where he led complex deals in healthcare and energy and utilities. He attended the illustrious Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, which, if you cannot tell, I also attended. Had to do it. He earned his undergraduate degree and MBA with a concentration in finance from FAMU, and he currently lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife and 2 boys. So Ade writes the checks and knows where the money is going. And closing out our panel, we have Vincent Better, who is the Vice President of Technically Media. He is a 20-year digital media professional, developing and supporting strategies around ways to maximize business opportunity, leveraging digital events and content marketing. After several years of traveling the country as a digital specialist, he became reestablished in Philly and quickly reconnected with the startup community a few years ago. Currently in partnership with Philadelphia's Commerce Department, the Temple Fox School alum is leading the Most Diverse Tech Hub initiative as part of the leadership team at Technically, the originators of Philly Tech Week, now in its 11th year. So Vincent has been around and he's seen the places all over the country and he knows what's going on. So I'm going to start us off because I love that we have this perspective, a multi-city perspective, multi-country perspective actually represented on this panel. And so as we're talking about how communities across the country can mobilize to support underrepresented founders, I'd love to just ask each of you, What are you seeing where you are, either where you live or where you're spending a lot of time working? Because we tend to have this vision of startup activity that is very Silicon Valley, Bay Area focused and centric, but that's a unique place in our country, and many other cities and areas are doing it their own way. So what are you each seeing in terms of how underrepresented founders are mobilizing and being supported by the communities where they operate? And so, Monica, I'm going to start with you to give us your perspective both on what you're seeing in Detroit and then through your work globally with the other organizations you're active with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for us, and I think most cities like Detroit, when we first started doing this work about, I say 10 to 15 years ago, it was just even unheard of to think of having an entrepreneurial ecosystem. Most of those cities were then, while they were developing the ecosystem, then after the fact, and they were trying to bring in, okay, now let's focus on what we're doing for our underrepresented founders. And I think one of the things that I've seen in common with a few cities, like those represented here, is that they had a majority minority population. They had a strong presence in those cities, and so they tried to build that in as part of the DNA from the ground up. And I think I've seen that pattern repeated over and over and over again. So it's past just learning the skills. It's understanding how can we uniquely recruit these founders, because they may or may not be located in the traditional pitch competitions and then the traditional co-working spaces and things like that. It's being thoughtful about how we recruit them, being thoughtful about how we nourish the relationships, and understanding of the barriers that they face when they're trying to actually, raise capital for their companies. And then past that, how do we help them grow and help them understand that, particularly venture is not this evil thing. It could be a thing that helps you scale. I saw that a lot with the earlier, entrepreneurship practitioners. They're really pushing this narrative that those venture capitalist people are trying to steal your company. They want to take your equity, kind of thing. And I think a lot of that was just unawareness of how things can happen. Venture isn't for everyone, but it is one lever that can grow companies. And I think underrepresented founders, the programs I'm seeing both in Detroit and in other cities where we do work, have been very specific on hitting these levers for underrepresented founders so that they have just as much ability to scale as the general population.
Awesome. Ade, would love to get your take on that as well. What are you seeing in Washington, D.C. or the other geographies where you're working and where you're investing?
Yeah. First and foremost, it's an honor to be here. Honor to be here with your team, Monica, Vincent. The work that you all are doing is so important. Monica, I know actually there's some of the folks that we work with that were early backstage founders. So I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing. So DC has always been a tale of two cities. It was a city that was built by, designed by our ancestors, Black folk. But in many ways, not just post Emancipation Proclamation, but even into now, this is a city of great division. So you're still seeing social determinants of health kind of representative in terms of that big divide that we've seen nationally in terms of COVID cases, deaths, etc. But on the other side of it, we're seeing a lot of founders that we had identified and supported close to 5 years ago now start to emerge after the pivot and after what we're calling this kind of great dispersion to reposition their companies and raise venture capital. So to give a couple of examples, we have some great direct-to-consumer companies that had shifted from brick and mortar to online, so using digital strategies to acquire and sell to customers. There's a food truck company that's actually doing very, very well now. That's kind of taking advantage of this dispersed consumption and using mobile apps in order to connect buyers to sellers. And we're also seeing traditional brands, really do amazing things in order to reorient themselves around the customer base. I think what's different now that we're seeing now that our vaccination rate, last time I checked, it's starting to get towards a 50% rate. Our cases are coming down and the business closures have now kind of stabilized. A lot of our folks are starting to raise capital, seed round, Series A round, so $500 to $2 million. And the fact that they're capturing that capital, I think, is indicative of not only their ability to create value in these new in this new market, but also be able to do that after proving for a year that, they can pretty much navigate everything. So we're excited on that side because a lot of great founders are doing amazing things that happen to be of color. But on the other side of it is, of course, with many cities, there's still a great divide as it relates to the wealth gap, social determinants of health, and just general access to these new economies.
Awesome. Awesome. So Vincent, you're up next, but I have two questions for you. The first is one that we just got through the QA. Is this session being recorded?
Yes, sessions will all be recorded throughout the entire day.
Awesome. All right. Back to being a panelist, no longer having to manage the back end as well.
Right.
So technically is in a bunch of places. So I know you're based in Philly, you're from Baltimore. Those are two big technically audiences, but you're able, to get a line of sight into multiple markets. What does it look like from what you're seeing? Are cities moving in lockstep, or are there specific regional differences? What's true for you?
Yeah, there are certainly regional differences. Just when you talk about the population generally, the size of the cities, the divide of DC, which was just mentioned, which is not unique to DC. Philadelphia has a very similar environment where there's just a chasm between, businesses of a different type. So what I'm seeing, though, on the positive side is really understanding how these businesses can tap into some of the resources that they need to lay their foundations and then to scale. Great programs, and this is just an unsolicited plug for Comcast and the RISE program, which they recently launched in the past year, which is a great example of how larger organizations here in the Philadelphia area in particular are reaching out to these smaller, Black and Latinx businesses to figure out ways that they can support them in a meaningful way, not just cut them a check and keep it moving, but how can they invest in them, in their infrastructure, in their business plans, all the things that they will need to really maximize in order to take their business to a level, if not the next level. We're also seeing programs of the likes of Power Up, which is run through CCP, Community College of Philadelphia, which is also an early stage entrepreneurial support program, because that's where a lot of us get tripped up, right? It's like we have this great idea, but we don't know what to do with it. We don't know how to monetize it. We don't know how to market it. I can make the best cupcakes in the world, but if I can't tell anybody about it or put my cupcakes in front of the cupcake buyer, it doesn't matter. So how do you go about really taking advantage of the resources that help you figure out how to maximize your cupcakes with the people that ultimately will buy and eat them? So there's a lot of good things that are happening. There's still much work to be done. A lot of businesses are still very underfunded, very under supported from a consumer perspective, and just a lot of businesses that aren't being established. When you think about the population of Philadelphia, I'm going to quote these numbers and hope they're remotely close because we just reported on this a few months ago. Maybe 2 out of every 1,000 businesses, small businesses in Philadelphia is Black owned. Maybe 1.5, I'm close, I may not be exact, but maybe 1.5 are Latin or some other, minority designation, while 21 are majority. So 21 of 1,000. So there's a 20x difference in the number of Black-owned businesses versus majority-owned businesses in the city of Philadelphia, which is the near opposite of the actual population. So as we try to address that through organizations like Ben Franklin Technology Partners, PIDC, and as I mentioned, Comcast, these resources are bubbling up and more entrepreneurs are becoming aware of them and how they can take advantage of them to grow their businesses.
Awesome. So I'm going to ask this next one, and whomever would like to answer, but please do. But don't feel if this is not your one and you don't want to dig in, you don't have to. But Philly, Detroit, Baltimore, DC, these are cities that have long histories of being really rich, majority, minority, very strong Black populations. DC was the original chocolate city. Detroit, I believe now is still over 90% Black. Vincent, as you just mentioned, Philadelphia remains a majority minority city. But these are also cities that are undergoing resurgences and rebirths, and they're being, gentrified, and there are a lot of newcomers that are coming into those places. And there tends to be some tension that happens when that happens. And certainly as it pertains to attracting founders and creating, emerging startup ecosystems. So I'd love to get your takes on how you're seeing that play out in your city, that difference between, local resident, long time been there versus newcomer, and kind of what can be the supports or the services and resources that could help ease some of those and make sure that everyone's getting an equitable shot to found a successful company.
No, I can jump in really quickly. I know from a Detroit perspective, we had a reputation issue for many years. Detroit was one of the original Renaissance cities of technology and innovation and growth, and it had died off, and we had lost a lot of the population. And I think it was about 2008, 2009, when it really kind of started the trend back up. And that was after the financial crisis and some of those things. And one of the things that we saw a lot is initially there was a clash in New Detroit, Old Detroit. And I think that was something that people were very sensitive about. And I think they were sensitive that people were excited about the city, but that they weren't supporting the residents that had been there for decades, building businesses and loyal to the infrastructure. But I think I wouldn't say we've fully been past that, but I think we have definitely shifted to a definite inclusive. Like there's been a mass surge of people either who grew up in the area or grew up in surrounding areas who have moved back to the region, and then also folks who had always been there, but thought that if they were going to go to the next level and build a business, they were going to have to go to the coasts or they were going to have to go somewhere else, who have since, recommitted to, figuring out what they can do here. And I think a lot of both the corporate side programs that we had put in place, as well as a lot of the city and state infrastructure and programs have helped to dispel some of that by creating opportunities that are based on, current location versus, how long you've been in the city. And then also maybe giving support to those who have been there, for, 10, 15 years, building businesses and trying to figure out well, how can we make this business scale now? What's missing? What are the levers that are missing? For us, I do remember a lot of that tension in the earlier days. I think now it's just one of the things that we're known for as far as being an entrepreneurial ecosystem is really about the inclusiveness and the fact that so many other founders are doubling down on making sure that the founder next to them is being successful too. As long as they're, obviously open to, partnerships and things in other cities and across the country, but especially those who are here, because we know that their success is our success. So we want all of them to be successful. And the more that we help support their business, even if they're not in our industry or our vertical, then we're going to be in a much better spot. We're going to be in a much better spot to just rise the overall capital and all those different things.
Somebody wants to make a cameo.
I know. He wants something. That's what he wants. Yeah. So I think for DC, it's such an interesting narrative because the city has always had this tension in terms of economics and even just geographics, right? You have Ward 7 and 8 that's literally divided by a river. And there was always these constant debates around, we don't call it food deserts because deserts happen naturally. We call it food apartheid, right? Because it's kind of a systemic issue, right? And on the other side of it, for this particular region, and we also include Ward 9, Montgomery County, there's a tremendous amount of wealth, Black wealth. I believe it's second to the Atlanta area. And so I think what we're now seeing is an unlocking of that wealth, not only on the Angel Capital side, but also just the general support systems, right? So if you are a retired, government worker or you're a retired executive, now we're seeing a lot of people emerge out of those spaces to support early stage founders in cybersecurity, in health tech, et cetera, right? So there's a lot of capital, also social capital that's being unlocked. But I think on the other side of it is, because the GDP of DC is so much driven by hospitality and tourism oftentimes is very driven by real estate access with low interest rates and just general accessibility becomes very difficult if you don't have the collateral. And as Andre Perry wrote in one of his books, the reason why Blacks struggle so much financially is because our assets are undervalued, our homes are undervalued, our communities are undervalued, our businesses are undervalued, right? So there is this ongoing ebb and flow as it relates to our founders, our communities proving that we can be excellent, we can exceed expectations, not only on a return standpoint. You're seeing Black women out index not only new business formation but performance, and yet and yet, right? So Monica and her team, I mean, they literally served as a catalyst for the narrative of support Black women, period, right? But even still, 10 years on, we're having to, use storytelling to create FOMO, right? So partake foods, right? Um, um, Black and green. Right. So these are Black women founders that are doing amazing things that we want to be able to normalize. And I think right now what we're doing is we're going through a process of normalization where these companies that have been established 5, almost 10 years ago are now starting to emerge, getting to the millions of dollars of revenue, which then the capital will follow because capital don't like missing out on opportunity. But it ain't gonna come without struggle. With this divide, there's a lot of societal issues that are kind of happening now, a lot of catalyst moments that are happening now. But we believe we'll win in this space for sure.
Awesome.
Yeah, and just to kind of go back to the gentrification part of the question, Philadelphia is, I think, uniquely positioned in the Northeast corridor, right, between Washington, D.C. and New York and Boston, where those cities were already more expensive and their gentrification has accelerated. Philadelphia, while going through the same process, is doing so at a much slower pace. So those opportunities that may exist in those bookend cities are suddenly more attractive here because the cost of living hasn't tripled in the past 10 years. And that's a hyperbolic example, but it's just not moving as quickly. And so what a lot of what I'm seeing is some folks that are just like saying, hey, DC, the VC market is crowded and it's too expensive. Hey, New York, the VC market is crowded and it's too expensive. Where else can I go that still allows me access to this market or that market? And Philadelphia is right in the middle. So we are certainly well positioned for that. And I've seen some people that considered leaving that decided to stay because of that. And I've seen people that came from those bookend cities for that same reason. So I think as long as this maintains, I don't know how much longer we will not quicken the pace, because it's happening, but just not as quickly. I mean, if you look at, what's happened in Brooklyn over the past 10 years, that hasn't been like a significant change at that scale in Philadelphia. So a lot of what's happening here is happening, but businesses are still able to take advantage of kind of the smallness, if you will, of the city and the connections that you can still make interpersonally. Like you don't have to, find a VC in a sea of hundreds of thousands or millions of people. If I wanted to find Arlen, I could probably find her, right? So a lot of accessibility that comes with the fact that the population isn't turning over quite as quickly, and therefore makes it attractive for businesses to either retain a presence here, even if they decide to open another location elsewhere, or relocate to the city because of the accessibility it provides without the ramp up in living expenses.
Awesome. So I'd love to hear from you all. What are the kinds of startups that you're seeing underrepresented founders creating? And tell me about kind of macro trends that you're seeing in terms of the problems, founders are focused on creating a company to solve. And then if it exists, don't want to, square peg round hole, but something that personally got you really excited, like, this is going to be huge. And, a founder that doesn't look like the media archetype of a startup founder is going to be the one to blow this thing out and have a huge success.
I know in Detroit, people automatically assume that we are focused on automotive companies, which there is some
Motor City.
There is some truth to that, but we are definitely we have a ton of stuff in autonomous vehicles. We have the first autonomous highway and all those kind of whole playgrounds of things that you see here that you just don't see in other cities. That always gets me excited because you constantly are seeing new spaces and places there. But I think we've been also one of our longer standing before mobility and autonomy came really high. One of our longer standing sectors has always been life sciences and biotech and medtech. Medtronic and Pfizer and all those groups have always been here for years. They've always had locations and or headquarters here. And a lot of that has to do with the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor being less than half hour away, thereabouts. But life sciences, biotech, medtech. But then also what I've liked to see and what I was excited to see definitely is in the consumer product space. whether that is fully, tech, like tech consumer products, but also those that are just looking at different services models and brick and mortar and things like that. I think across the board, a lot of them have a social edge as well. And I think I've seen Black founders in all of those spaces do very well. I think things that excite me are things like Deep How, who is AI focused learning gaps. They're a platform that teaches how manufacturing learning gaps using AI. Again, we are a huge space and place for manufacturing, but we're also one of the largest, if not the largest, per capita population of engineering talent in the country. And so we've always had these skilled jobs and these high-tech jobs, but we also struggle with the minority community, or just broadly the minority community in the United States, on closing the skills gap. So when you see platforms like DeepHow and other AI-enabled spaces and places, I'm loving seeing how they're thinking that and how they're approaching it. Other things are like Guildform, which is actually which is one of the Backstage companies, also a Black female founder, which is focusing on it's a high-end marketplace that allows you come in with a brand and you can do 3D design of your jewelry and high-end luxury goods. And so they've gone on and had all these mass successes with Black Panther and all these other things like that. But they're pulling designs in via tech, and then they're allowing it to be 3D printed and then shipped. And they experienced a huge surge in the midst of the pandemic. And I saw that because they had all digital pipelines and all digital distribution markets. And I keep seeing that pattern repeated because we're really well known in this area for understanding how to do supply chain, how to do distribution, how to build things like that take that high tech and need a lot of pieces. We have a lot of that skill set and a lot of that expertise here. So all those different spaces and places that are around a lot of different industries, I've seen a lot of play, and a lot of that has nice presence from underrepresented founders.
Yeah, so I'll speak to a couple of our DC folks and then kind of talk nationally. So mentioned them before I go into a little detail. Good Finds, a company that came through one of our early stage programs. Love what they're doing, for the simple fact that they're kind of playing on data, right? So before the pandemic, you pick up the app, and instead of waiting in line for the food truck, because the food truck culture in DC was super, super popular, you would make your order cashless, pick it up, and go about your day, right? Then when the pandemic hit, it kind of created this new use case, if you will, not only for touchless delivery, but also allowing the food trucks to find density, right? So you have a lot of luxury apartments or spaces in places where people, maybe they didn't want to order from a restaurant, or they're doing events, right? And so they actually turned it and used data to help food trucks understand both the geography, time, as well as the customer type that actually will lead to better business outcomes, right? So going from a simple connecting, an inefficient market through technology, now you're actually helping food trucks, which historically, because they're not business owners, they're not like entrepreneurial, they're more so focused on the culinary art, help them survive through data. So love what they're doing there. Another sister founded a company called Susu. So the traditional means of pulling together resources in order to invest. So let's say Monica had an idea, we come together, we form a Susu. I put in 5,000, you put in 5,000, right? And then we fund that idea. So it's a technology layer that sits on top of a traditional, kind of banking concept, but it has a lot of back-end UX and some elements to help people form collective capital groups. And she's doing a lot of amazing work with banks and just some really, really dope stuff. And she's an incredible superstar. One of the things I think is really, really exciting is kind of seeing the convergence and the economics as it relates to software companies as well as CPG companies, right? So we're all digital now. We're all using social media to identify and acquire customers, but now we're seeing CPG companies go direct to consumer. So some of them that may not want to go onto Amazon now want to go direct. So one of our companies, Pizza Cupcake out of New York, she did an incredible job on and Shark Tank through negotiations. But she had dreams of having her product at a baseball stadium, right? And then COVID hit. So these are perishable goods that then she had to pivot and figure out how to get directly to your door across the nation using dry ice, right? And so now she's kind of working through the economics of direct to consumer, using the brand to kind of elevate that experience to then get the repeat business, right? So just like a software company, it's all about that initial experience, right? And so we just are amazed of what happens when you create platforms, Vincent, Monica, you see it, right? You create the platform, just get the heck out of their way and then do amazing things. So I think the play for this next phase is absolutely going to be data. It's going to be customer experience. You get that average order value up, you get the repeat sales going, differentiation, but then also process automation. I'm really bullish, not on the artificial intelligence side per se, but how do you automate processes to then create higher value for either the customer experience or improve margins for the business itself. So those are some things that we're really excited about.
Yeah, I don't have a specific business in mind, but I'm encouraged by some of the diversity I'm seeing across industries in the region. So, because of our proximity to many different areas. The Delaware Valley, certainly much bigger than Philadelphia itself. So when you talk about, here, Eds and Meds still run the show, right? Like, have all these educational institutions, great hospital and patient care facilities, Penn, Temple, Children's Hospital, Jefferson. There's just a lot. And I was, a part of facilitating or supporting a panel earlier from Penn and Center for Innovation around just all the great things that are happening specifically in healthcare. Because whether it's telemedicine or inpatient, in-house treatment, at-home treatment, all of these things are really exploding. And we're seeing more representation in all those spaces. But then also, when you look at just south of us in Delaware, what you have around manufacturing and agricultural sciences, that doesn't get as much of a light, but we are starting to make some inroads in because we realize there's opportunity there. And every industry is ripe for some sort of innovation. There's no industry right now that cannot be touched in some capacity. So many of those industries, although Eds and Meds run the show here, are still highly represented in this area. And I'm encouraged to see more of us actually looking at manufacturing, looking at financial services, and trying to figure out ways to make even microtransactions more efficient, but scalable so that, to the point that was just made, that rinse and repeat cycle where you can just have people get into the platform and it's self-serve at that point, and then you can move on and start to innovate elsewhere.
Awesome. So I just want to quick housekeeping for the audience. This is going to be my last question. So get your questions into the sidebar and the chat so we can open it up. But got to talk about the money. Can't have this conversation without talking about the money. So just want to, you need money to start a business, and ideally you make some if you do it right. So want to dig in on that question a little bit. And so we've heard the stats, but I do want to ground this in a little bit of data for anyone who's unfamiliar. So latest report is that for 2020, overall, about $147.6 billion in venture capital funding was deployed. Black founded companies got just over 3% of that. Which is like 3 to 4 billion. And when you look at Black and Latinx women founders, didn't even get 1%, just approaching half of 1% of the total amount deployed. And certainly we saw last year a number of investors saying, we need to do better. Our industry has to get better. We need to be more inclusive. We're going to launch this initiative or that initiative. But that needle isn't really moving. So I'd love to talk through there a little bit. And one thing I do want to note is I am certainly not asking the folks who didn't create the problem to solve it, but you are close up enough to see what's happening. So what are the things that need to happen that don't get the shine? It's easy to say, oh, let's be unbiased or put your email on your website. Those are easy wins and folks have done them and the money still isn't there. So what are some of the solutions that can happen for check writers to actually invest more in underrepresented founders and things that may not be as obvious even to people who are pretty close and in this world if they haven't been specifically in that position? So Ade, I'm going to start with you because That is your job as a check writer, but Monica, you're an investment scout as well. Vincent, you've got a great point of view, so would love to hear everyone kind of chime in on this one.
Yeah, and thanks for positioning those stats, because I think it just also reinforces when you look at some of the data around Black funds and Black fund managers. There's a tremendous amount of progress that's been made since 2020 up until now, and an interesting correlation. It's like 1 to 3% of LP capital that's been going to funds 2020 to 2021. About 1%, 3% has gone to Black founders, right? Or Black funds. And so, now that we lead with the thesis that if you put more people on the check writing table that look like us, then you'll be able to increase representation of founders who then get the checks because they're not pattern matching based off of old archetypes, right? So there's that. But then let's get them to fund 2 and fund 3, because it's not just a fund 1. Yes, the TechCrunch article, all that stuff is dope, but you got to get the upper decile performance in order to make sure that you're able to get to fund 2, fund 3. So Harlem Capital, right? So those folks are representative of what it needs to happen in order to grow the team, grow the portfolio, grow the story. But I think the other side of it is, and a lot of people kind of take it the wrong way, but I think it's spot on. We should let Black and brown founders lose money at the same rate as white founders. VC, it sounds weird, right? But it's true, right? Like, just because you invested in that one sister and you put her at the very top left of your website, like, that's a lot of pressure for that sister, right? And, yes, we may be magical, but we're not magic, right? So you should not expect us to perform, right, better than the average, which, by the way, a majority of VC funds don't return the fund. Majority of VC-backed companies fail, right? So it is about the freedom, the emancipation to be able to experiment and learn and grow market opportunities and fail and do it all over again and be able to build that social capital. That's what equity looks like. Like, equity doesn't necessarily look like the appreciation of equity value. It actually looks like the equitable opportunity to mess up, right? My son's upstairs, but I didn't want to say the word, but you know what I mean, right? So I think, if we think like that and kind of use that as a guidepost, that will for sure kind of change the narrative. But most importantly is making sure that the LPs, right? So if your mom and them pension, right? Bus driver association, whatever, where's my pension money going? Like, our HBCUs, right? Where is our endowment money going, right? And when you start to ask those questions and you start to say, hey, why don't you take a look at these funds, right? That also helps to move the needle forward.
Yeah, and I would add, VCs, I wish they would be a little bit more intentional about seeking those businesses. They're getting deluged with all types of, I don't want to use language that your son might not want to hear, but stuff that really isn't viable. They sift through it, they make decisions. But I think, and this is just my perspective, that many VCs are very much reactive, right? They get a bunch of stuff, they look through it, they figure out what they're interested in, what they're not. And because they have so much that they may or may not be interested in, they don't actively look for those other opportunities that might be from a different cultural background. So if VCs are saying, hey, I want to make sure that we invest this much in diverse businesses, but your applications or your proposals or your pitches don't match that, then you've got to be more proactive about finding those to make decisions on versus just hoping that your organic requests create the balance that you're trying to support.
No, I agree. I agree with everything both of you guys have said. I always tell folks, like, when we always counsel our founders to double down on things that work when they're trying to figure out their business models. I think that's the same thing in VC funding. The things that we've seen work is when we see more underrepresented and female founders. We've seen female-led funds. When we see female and underrepresented led funds, or at least on the leadership team, we see a higher number of female and underrepresented founders getting funding. And I think we double down in spaces and places like that. But I think we get a lot of pushback, in particular with Backstage. And one of the things that we were hearing over and over again, and one of the reasons why I kind of joined in when we were doing the Global Accelerator, was they were saying that most funders said that they did not have a pipeline. And so we had 1,900 pushing 2,000 applications for 24 spaces. And we're turning people away left and right. So I think the pipeline is not an issue, but I think there's that point of figuring out like how you can justify a different pattern, if you will, in your fund for someone who doesn't have the same background or whatever, but does potentially have a $1 million idea or multi-million-dollar idea. You've got to be able to seek those folks. And if you don't know how to find those folks, then partner with a fund, co-invest with a fund that does, or find organizations that have the ability to go into communities and gain their trust. Because that's the other side of it, is that a lot of this is a relationship-based business. What you don't have relationships with these communities, you don't come into spaces and places where these founders are open to sharing their financials and their information and things like that, because they may or may not know the norms of the industry, but also just that awareness and that access. Then partner with someone who does, and go about it that way. I think I've seen more successes from things like that than people kind of coming in raw and saying, well, here's our Black founder program X, and we're going to put a big check and be on the TV and say what we did, but then we don't have any numbers a year from now to show it. I think in the pandemic, one of the things that we were all very cognizant of is that we all had to communicate like this. And so in the midst of it already being a relationship-based business, you're not getting those chance encounters, you're not getting those organic things, you're getting a better feel for people. You're seeing them through this one-dimensional space, and then you're expected to be able to build a relationship with someone who's already skeptical on a business model or a founder that didn't match the pattern that they were looking for in the first place. So where we had been seeing like at least a tiny uptick on how funding was going right before the pandemic, we lost a lot of that during the pandemic because interactions were relegated to spaces and places like this. If you weren't already part of the group, then you weren't necessarily going to get another chance to have a Zoom call or Zoom pitch or things like that. So I do agree. Like, I do think there's a lot of different spaces. One of the things that you mentioned, I want to double down on is those public funds. Those pension plans and things like that for public employees and things like that. That's a space that I'm very fascinated with right now, because and also equity crowdfunding. Any of those places where we're able to activate the community or activate a broader, diverse set of people who get a vote and where the money is going to go. I think that changes the dynamics of the investments that are made as well. And I've seen a lot of gains in that, where they're like, okay, this is the teachers union that is 70% Black or whatever. They should have a chance to have input on where people invest their money. The same thing for different municipalities, police unions, and things like that. These public-based funds are huge areas where if we had a little bit more of that democracy on them getting a chance to weigh in on how their money is spent and invested, we've seen really good returns on that being more diverse and actually better outcomes. So I think more doubling down more on things that work, and then finding those partnerships and pipelines of spaces and places where you just don't have access on both sides of the fence.
Awesome. So we took that question from the investor perspective. I'm going to take a question from the chat that seems to be coming from the founder perspective. And so this is coming from Naila Madison. And the question is, do you think the lack of distribution and funding is because we don't know all of the places where we can seek funding? So in terms of a founder, what should founders do in terms of educating themselves on how can I get the money I'm going to need to run, grow, scale this business?
One, they should read Technically.
Subscribe to Technically.
Right. That's a good place to start. And yeah, just as I mentioned a moment ago about the VCs being more proactive, as a business owner, if you're looking for those opportunities, you're going to have to do some homework. Some of these VCs hide out. So it doesn't mean that they are not accessible, but also doesn't mean you're going to be able to just like find them on Facebook either. So you may have to just dig a little bit. But also you want to make sure that you are seeking the founder that is relevant to your business. Every founder doesn't fund every business. So if you just like, put out applications or go to pitch competitions and I'll go back to my cupcake analogy, and you make cupcakes, but none of these founders have ever founded anything relevant to cupcakes, they're probably not going to do your cupcake either. So find some folks that have invested in cupcakes, whether it be because of whatever reason, and you've got a better chance. But in order to know that, instead of just like putting in the work in 100 different places, there may be 3 of those. Find out who those 3 are, and then go hard on those 3, and don't worry about the other 97.
Yeah. I mean, I would say from a tactical perspective, the little secret in the VC space is that funders will not invest in people that they don't like. It's just this fact. It's just this fact. It's like you don't want to go out with a person that you don't necessarily align with, right? And so I think it's important that you, to Vince's part, get really smart about the investors that you seek to reach out with. One really great resource in addition to technically is NFX. They have this product called Signal, and what essentially it allows you to set up a profile and then be able to segment the kinds of investments based off of their sector, et cetera. Don't just stop there. Go to their website, go to their portfolio, understand their thesis, who they've invested. So a lot of them, publish their memos. Bessemer has published other memos that kind of looks at why they invest in these companies to get in the mind of the founder. That's your pre-work. Then when you get out to doing your outreach, craft your email saying, hey, I'm the founder. I've done these 3 things over the past year and a half in terms of traction. I see you invest in insert whatever kind of company. I'd love to get 15 minutes on your calendar to share a little bit more about what I'm working on, right? And so, you've been thoughtful with that approach. You've been very specific and not broad, where it seems like it's a kind of spam email. That's the cold approach. On the other side, in terms of kind of building your own social capital, don't be afraid to just reach out for a 15-minute conversation, for somebody to pick their brain, saying, hey, I'm early, right? One of the founders that I work with, what he did before his Series A, he talked to a lot of Series A investors knowing that he wasn't ready yet, and they reverse engineered the metrics he needed to hit in order to attract those investors. What's my annual recurring revenue to be? How many customers do I need to have? What does my tracks need to actually look like, right? And so that way you're being thoughtful. You've built the relationship. You can follow up 6 months, say, here's the things that I've done, and then you're able to build your own social capital.
Yeah, I agree.
So,
go ahead. I think we're out of time, right?
I was gonna, we're at 1:46. What I'm going to do for everyone here is I'm dropping all of our panelists' websites. Technically, I gave you the link right to subscribe, so you can keep up and see what's happening just through Monica's company in there. Venture Catalyst is in there. Ade, I will throw yours in as well. So if you want to follow up or follow the work that you all are doing, I would encourage you to take a look through everyone's websites, follow the social channels you see listed. To our panelists, thank you so much for the time, the information, the words that you have dropped on us this afternoon. I could go for another hour, but I know, first of all, Vincent won't let me because there's a whole schedule today and we have things planned out. So I hope you all are able to join the following sessions the rest of this afternoon. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time and attention. It has been absolutely wonderful and can't wait to do this again, hopefully in person when health and safety will allow.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.
All right,
thank you for having us,
all.
everybody.
Have a great afternoon.
Yep. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.